The title of our event tonight is Palestine and the Indivisibility of Justice, which is extraordinarily fitting and timely for the current times that we're living in. Before we begin, I'd like to just read a quote. This is a quote by Dr. Edward Said, which, if you have not yet, must go visit our mural right outside of the Student Center, outside of the exit of the bookstore. Humanism is the only, and I would go so far as saying, the final resistance we have against the inhumane practices and injustices that disfigure human history. And this panel will address exactly those questions of humanism, justice, and how to build bridges between our communities to fight injustice everywhere. I am one of your MCs, Lubna Katami. I am a former member of GUPS. Which is the General Union of Palestine Students. I'm also the General Coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement and the Executive Director of the Arab Cultural and Community Center.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amiz Enzaleh Barnes. I serve as the Assistant Director of Program Services here for the Cesar Chavez Student Center.
Before we begin with this really exciting program for this evening, we just want to go over a couple housekeeping issues. We shouldn't have to remind you, but please put your phones on silent. We have members from the Palestinian Youth Movement and from the General Union of Palestine Students that are selling some crafts over here on the side. We also have some really exciting t-shirts with images of the mural, which are right here at the first table on the right-hand side. And we also have a screen printing little station over there that's screen printing images of Handala, the cartoon figure drawn by Najib Ali, right here on the left-hand side. There is coffee and tea in the back, as well as food, so please help yourselves. And also, the restrooms are right outside these two doors and to the right-hand side.
Along with that, we wanted to make sure that you know that the refreshments are in the back and they will help go towards the program of AMED and the Dr. Edward Said Distinguished Lecture Series. So we'd encourage you to visit the tables and find out how you can contribute more and participate in that initiative of the College of Ethnic Studies, as well as to further the legacy that the students of GUPS and the community have started over 4 years ago. We'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Dean Pereira, who is on your program. He is the Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies, and he is not with us this evening. Oh, I'm sorry, Dean of Education. He's not with us this evening because he is preparing the world for his first grandchild. And so we send him congratulations. And we also wanted to take this moment to acknowledge that we are on Native American land and that we are on land that belongs to the Ohlone people. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Kenneth Montero, the Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies. The College of Ethnic Studies here at San Francisco State is the only one in the nation. Dr. Montero served formerly as the University Dean of Human Relations and professor and former chair of the Psychology Department here at San Francisco State. He received his PhD from Stanford University in experimental psychology with a specialization in cognitive psychology and his bachelor's degree in psychology from Dartmouth College. He has also served as a national board member for the Association of Black Psychologists and is a current member of the American Associations of Black in Higher Education. Please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Kenneth Montero.
Good evening. Oh, I've got to request some cultural and personal privilege here. If I can't hear you, I don't know that you're there, and if I don't know that you're there, since I live in relationship, I'm not sure that I'm here. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for indulging a tired administrator who happens to be here, but no way weary at all. because this is an exciting evening. Dr. Pereira, who is going to be here, you know, is not for the wonderful reasons of they're expecting a new birth. And I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that things are born, people are born, and ideas are born when they're supposed to be. I'm glad to be acknowledged that we are on the First Nations land, that we're on the Ohlone land, and we all have various traditions for how we tend to begin a very important, a very meaningful experience. And the rituals, the specifics of the rituals may be specific to your particular heritage, cultures, or personal beliefs, but they generally do acknowledge who your host is, and our first host of the Ohlonies. But we also generally, in many of our ways, call back to those on whose shoulders we stand, whether they are living or dead. We speak to those that we're in solidarity with, whether they're here in this room or elsewhere. And we also tend to recommit ourselves to those who are coming after, those who are living, and those who are yet to be born. And it's wonderful that one of them is being born right now. I tell you, a baby born into the Pereira family is a baby to be reckoned with. So it's my pleasure and my honor to bring welcome on behalf of the College of Ethnic Studies. And when one gets to use administrative privilege, one should. So as the senior, and I would have deferred to the Dean of the College of Education because he was a dean longer than I, bring welcome on behalf of San Francisco State University. For those of you who are here to commemorate the 4th anniversary of the Palestinian cultural mural honoring the late Professor Edward Said. And thank you, Ms. Katami and Ms. Barnes, for emceeing and also the welcome that you gave me. But they also might have mentioned that they were part of that process, very instrumental to the process of bringing that mural to fruition. I'd also like to thank the panelists who have come here from the African Heritage and Indigenous Women of Color delegations to Palestine. All of us are busy, but some of you have to actually get here from other busy lives and other locations, so I want to thank you. By name, I'd like to take a privilege of starting with Professor Abdulhadi, our senior scholar in the Arab Muslims Ethnicities and Diaspora Initiative, an exciting new area, and Professor Angela Davis, as a former professor here, meaning that you're back at home. But in that context, I want to say that all of the others who are here, and if I do mispronounce the newer names that I've just learned, please help me as we continue to know each other. Gerald Lenoir, Waziyatawin, Gina, Dent, Melissa Garcia. Know that wherever you are, where we are, you are home, so you are here, and you are home with us. It was told to you that the College of Ethnic Studies is the only one in the nation, and it was created out of struggle. Struggle led by students. Struggle led by students first of the Black Student Union and the Third Liberation Front, and then including a larger range of students, faculty, staff, and community members who risked their lives and literally, their professional and sometimes their literal lives. The original 4 departments, American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, Black Studies, and La Raza, as they were called at the time, represented the struggles of many who were involved, but not all. There were others, and specifically for today, there were Arabs, Muslims involved, and some Palestinians, and in that context, I come in solidarity. As this event approached, I reread the program for the commemoration and the installation of this wonderful mural, designed by Drs. Fayette Weiss and also Susan Green, and painted communally by students and community members in a culturally and very spiritually meaningful manner. I remember the committee meetings. I remembered hours, then I remembered tens of hours, and I think I might have even remembered hundreds of hours, I think. And I remember the detailed homework on every point of not just the mural, but of the consultation and the homework that went into each of the shapes that would be formed into this total mural. I also remembered the intense debate, argument, yes against struggle to produce the art. And I also remembered the deep, abiding agreement that made it a mural for this campus and this community. That created the first known university mural, I believe, honoring Dr. Saeed and the Palestinian struggle at any university in the United States. This motif of struggle to achieve deep agreement, agreement anchored in conviction, issued forth with confidence, is essential to the process of seeking truth and justice. When one looks at it that way, I look forward to the message that will follow in this event. All movements of any substance, and as a social scientist, I'm usually careful about, notice I said usually careful about saying always or never. But all movements of any substance must engage in the struggle for truth and equitable place for all in the outcome. And when we say that, most of us imagine a physical struggle, and that is often necessary, but not always. But what is always necessary is the struggle for freedom and justice in the knowledge, consciousness, and wisdom of the people being liberated. Whether we're talking about Saeed, Che, Fanon, Tubman, Cabral, Woodson, freeing the mind, releasing the psychological chains are always essential. So how better to commemorate the struggle of Palestinians here in the global diaspora in Palestine? How better to honor Dr. Saeed, but to engage in collectively struggling with the ideas which may free our minds. And notice I said may free our minds. It gives us the opportunity to free our minds, but we will have to make that choice to be free. So I thank those in attendance, and I welcome you all, and I welcome you to the struggle for universal freedom and justice, and I will honor what you say in that I will engage it in my own mind, hoping to better free myself with what you offer. So thank you again for coming.
Now I would like to invite up some of the young, very promising women activists of GUPS, Zainab and Meha Harara. Meha is a SFSU senior majoring in business administration and accounting, and Zainab is a junior pursuing her bachelor's degree in business administration and information systems, and we need those people on our side.
Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. My name is Meha Harara.
And I am Zainab Harara. On behalf of the General Union of Palestinian Students and the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative,
We welcome you to Palestine and the Indivisibility of Justice. We are here to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the Palestinian Cultural Mural at San Francisco State University, a rich depiction of Palestinian heritage and a reminder of its perpetual pursuit for justice.
as an organization, we are dedicated to the political and cultural awareness necessary to support justice and equality for all Palestinians. The General Union of Palestinian Students has been one of the oldest organizations on this campus.
As young Palestinian American women, tonight is an exciting occasion for us because we have long admired our courageous, talented, and bright speakers.
Some we have admired from afar by reading about their profound work. Others we marched with down the streets of San Francisco, challenging the world to acknowledge our existence.
And just like the late Edward Said, our speakers are knowledgeable about the injustices committed across different parts of the world and are anything but timid in acting against them.
Tonight is a celebration of not just the Palestinian cultural mural, but all the murals that stretch long and proud across this beautiful campus.
That constantly remind us to strive and embrace righteousness for all.
Ladies and gentlemen,
this is an important evening, and so we present Palestine and the Indivisibility of Justice. Thank you. GUPS member and a huge part of this organizing committee for helping putting on this event. Please welcome Rasmiya Hamouda.
Good evening. I'm reading the I Am From There poem by Mahmoud Darwish, which is referred in the upper right-hand corner of the mural. I am from there. I have memories. Like any other man, I was born. I have a mother, a house with silver windows, friends and brothers. I have a prison cell's cold window, a wave, snatched by seagulls, my own view, an extra blade. Of grass, a moon at word's end, a life supply. Of birds, and an ology that cannot die. I walked and crossed the land before the cross, of swords, banqueted on what its body was. I come from there, and I return the sky, to its mother when it cries for her, and cry, for a cloud on its return, to recognize me. I have learned all words befitting a blood's court to break the rule. I have learned all the words to take. The lexicon apart for one noun's sake, the compound I must take, homeland. And the second poem that I'll be reading is also by Mahmoud Darwish. It's his farewell to Edward Said. New York, November, 5th Avenue. The sun, a plate of shredded metal. I ask myself, estranged in the shadow, is it Babel or Saddam? There, on the doorstep of an electric abyss, high as the sky, I met Edward. 30 years ago, time was less wild then. We both said, if the past is only an experience, make of the future a meaning and a vision. Let us go into tomorrow, trusting the condor of imagination and the miracle of grass. Thank you.
At this part of the program, we were told, but we were asked to offer our thoughts of our experiences working with the Palestinian community on the mural. And I didn't realize how many feelings and thoughts would come rushing to me, taking me back to that time between 2005 and 2007 when the members of GUPS were working on this mural so dedicatedly. But this is what I wanted to share. Imagine a young person just entering junior high school visiting the campus on a usual foggy day in the middle of July, on a go-to-college day where the expansiveness and tall buildings dwarf their familiar campus surroundings. Imagine a first-generation graduating high school senior attending their College Awareness Day, sponsored by one of our campus programs here, embarking on a journey that will impact their lives as they imagine themselves walking to and from class, being here on this campus. Along their experience, they will hear the university's goals. They'll see the mission statement. They'll see what it has the best to offer in its academics. Perhaps they'll hear from an administrator that has a really long title with a lot of initials, either pre their name or after their name. And after all that, the tours, will they see themselves here? Will they see their values here? Will they see their communities here? The journey of the Cesar Chavez Student Center, along with GUPS, in creating our murals organically resulted in shaping the cultural feel of this campus. And please know that our experience was not an institutional one. It was often us navigating it together as an auxiliary on this campus and as a student organization with little help. And as daunting as that was, we did find friends in the administration, and we did find a way to make a way out of no way. This journey was fueled by the voice and the activism of students of GUPS. And it was driven by three overarching values: self-determination, social justice, and human rights. Individually and collectively, each mural committee of the 6 murals that we have adorning our building, all of the students, including the members of GUPS and the Palestinian Committee on developing the mural, made a conscious effort every meeting of the hours, of the weeks, of the memos, of meetings upon meetings, a conscious effort to always uplift social justice, human rights, and self-determination through their experiences and through their community. And sometimes that's really hard to do when there's resistance to saying who you are and what you're about. Through the struggles of their community, historically and present, a mural is on our wall. The members of GUPS who served on the Palestinian Mural Committee inclusively led, framed and reframed social justice, human rights, and self-determination. They left a legacy to tell that junior high student coming on our campus, you do belong here. You do matter. Direct your actions towards social justice. Be determined in your goals. Get your education, uplift your rights of your community, and don't forget to tell your story. The mural artists, Dr. Green and Dr. Oasis, use their expertise, their style, their artistry, their creativity to create a seamless call of students and community to that first generation high school graduating person bound for our Ivy Towers, that you do matter here, that you do belong here. Direct your actions towards social justice. Be determined in your goals. Get your education. Uplift the rights of your community. And don't ever, ever forget to tell your story. Thank you.
Thank you, Ami, for those very inspiring words. 4 years ago, on November 2nd, the inauguration of the Edward Said Cultural Mural, I spoke on behalf of GUPS. And the last thing that I said was that the historical legacy of Palestinian activism at SFSU was not over. And in fact, it was just the beginning. Looking back on the mural, it's quite a bittersweet experience for me. I have a lot of feelings about why, once we had inaugurated the mural, that consciousness around Palestine had not swept SFSU, and the consciousness around justice had not swept across every student organization, and why the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program, which was established as an initiative in 2007, is yet today to be a program that is bringing in Arab and Muslim and non-Arab and Muslim students to come in and to learn about their histories, to learn about their communities, to engage in community organizing in a way that they are mentored by elders and by the university. So of course that's the bitter part of it, but what's the sweet part of it? Surprisingly, the censorship that we experienced with that mural, being told that we were not allowed to put up that mural because of 2 images, the right of return key and the image of Handala, the cartoon character drawn by Najil Ali, which was to represent the millions of Palestinian refugees denied to returning to their homelands and representing corruption and injustice for all people in the Arab world and beyond. Those 2 images were denied from that mural. And that battle to inaugurate this mural that lasted 3 years is the sweetest part of the victory. Because it is the battle. It is the battle that caused myself and the other GUB students to organize, to learn about our histories, to learn about why handala and the right of return key was so controversial, to learn about why Palestinians' right to existence, right to maintain their Palestinian identity, right to maintain their connection to Palestine, right to maintain their community intact, right to voice and for themselves speak about their histories, about a land that was stolen from them, about refugees that were kicked out of their land and denied to return, and about the rest of our brothers and sisters who still live under a military occupation that has lasted 63 years. Why that was so problematic, and why that was so controversial. The mural experience is what taught me why that was so controversial. It taught me that to connect to Palestine, I needed to connect to Palestinian youth in the United States. I needed to connect to Palestinian elders and to Arab elders who had come before us fighting this struggle for years and years and years. And it taught me that I had to connect to my brothers and sisters in the Women's Center and in MECHA and the Black Student Union and in every other student organization that has fought the same system of oppression, that has fought the same system of censorship and denial of their rights to existence, their denial of their basic rights, the denial of their right to speak on behalf of themselves and narrate their own history, to not have their histories told on their behalf by someone else. And it is those 3 years that we fought that I learned that. And so while the mural, when I pass it out there and I don't see the image of handala and the key, it will always be there in my mind, and it will always be there in the minds of Charlie and Ramsey and Jackie and all the other GUFS members who were with us. It will always be there in the mind of the Arab and Palestinian elders and community members that supported us and that mobilized for the mural because they knew it wasn't about art. They knew it wasn't only about images, and they knew it wasn't about colors, and it wasn't a little student project that went haywire. They knew that that project was about us, our right to existence, our right to persevere as a community, and our right to build bridges with the communities that share the struggles that we have. And that's why those 3 years that I did the most fighting probably in my entire life, and the most crying in my entire life, are the sweetest years of this mural. And it is those 3 years that taught me why 1968, College of Ethnic Studies emerging out of a student strike, the longest student strike of the history of this country, is so important. And why a program for Arab and Muslim students in the housed in the College of Ethnic Studies is not a great idea, but it has to happen. And it has to happen not only for our communities, but it has to happen so that we really talk about justice wholly. And so that we really talk about justice in a way that is not surface or opportunistic. Today, 4 years later, I am shocked that it's actually been 4 years. That's the first thing I have to say. But I think that this is the most important event that we can possibly be hosting in honor of the Edward Said Cultural Mural, because I know that my liberation as a Palestinian woman, I know that the Palestinian people's liberation will never be free until all people of the world are free. And I know that people of true consciousness and people who really believe in justice and freedom, who really believe in community empowerment, will continue to see our struggles as interconnected, and will continue to see Palestine as rooted in the struggle for global justice, and will continue to work hand in hand to empower our community organizations and to empower our ethnic studies program here at SFSU and in the world and in the United States in order for us to maintain this legacy. The spirit is still here. While activism doesn't show the way it did in 2002 and in 2006 and in 2007 at SFSU, and people are just working 40 hours a week just to pay their tuition and try to, find a warm place to sleep at the end of the night, the spirit is still here. And that spirit has been captured in Oakland with Occupy Oakland movement. That spirit has been captured in Egypt, in Tahrir Square. That spirit has been captured where people have always had that spirit, but it takes that extra step of organizing and community building to take it back. And that's what we're here to do, and I'm very, very, very honored to be the MC this evening, and very excited to hear the panelists. So without further ado, I would like to first introduce the panel as a whole. I think the reason that this panel is very particular, but also really groundbreaking, is because we tend to, on our own, split activism and community work from the academy. And that is not what this panel represents. This panel represents that inside of our universities, the people who are mentoring our young people, as I have been mentored, the people who are teaching us, the people who are pushing us to think, are the same people who have dedicated their life to community work, are the same people who have dedicated their life to justice and to freedom. And that's why this panel is so important.
So what we're going to do is go ahead and provide some background for each of the speakers, and then so that we can keep the flow. They will then go one by one in the order. Again, for housekeeping, please visit the back for refreshments. We have the printing station of the Handala. Please visit the tables that are on the left for the community organizations. And also we're also live streaming this. If you look at your program, there is a website address, so if you'd like to go back, and this will be archived, and particularly through the program of AMED, and find out more about the Distinguished Lecture Series in honor of Dr. Edward Said. After receiving her PhD in American History from Cornell University in 2000, she earned tenure and associate professorship in the History Department at Arizona State University, where she taught for 7 years. She currently holds the Indigenous Peoples Chair, Research Chair in the Indigenous Governance Program at the University of Victoria. She is the author, co-editor of 5 volumes, including For Indigenous Eyes Only, A Decolonization Handbook, and What Does Justice Look Like? The Struggle for Liberation in Dakota Homeland. Please welcome Waziyatawin.
Hamidak Yabi. Salam alaikum. Owas in Chantawashtayana Bach Uzapia. Damakota. Dakota ia Waziyatawin, Demien. Abheji who desizik abi makoche hechia tahawahia. Hello, my relatives. It's with a good heart that I greet all of you with a handshake. I am Dakota, and in the Dakota language, they call me Waziyatawin, which translates as Woman of the North. And I told you I come from the place where they dig for yellow medicine. And And in English, that place is known as the Upper Sioux Reservation, and it's located in southwestern Minnesota. Before I start tonight, I just want to make a few comments. First of all, I want to say what an honor it is for me to be here. I'm already impressed with everyone who's spoken, and I hope I don't disappoint. And I also want to say thank you to Rabab for inviting me. I'm glad I can be here. I also want to say that I appreciate people starting out with a recognition that this is Indigenous land first. And I also want to add my acknowledgement that this land belongs to the Muwekma Ohlone people. When I flew in last night and I looked out the window, all I could feel was incredible sadness. I kept wishing that I could see what the land looked like before it was under occupation by this culture. It was absolutely clear how devastating industrial civilization has been to this land. The Ohlone people were a people who lived sustainably here for thousands of years. The culture that is occupying this land, and I use occupation in a very different way than Occupy Oakland uses it. The culture that has been occupying this land is not sustainable. In fact, it's hopelessly unsustainable. And I think that this is one of the reasons why all of us should be committed to ending the colonial relationship and bringing down all of the structures, systems, and institutions of colonialism. It kills Indigenous life. Our lives depend on Indigenous life. If we want to live, it's in everyone's best interest to eradicate the ways of being that are destructive to the lands and to life. We all need to find another way to live. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about the dangers of abstraction, recognizing and resisting colonial occupation. I traveled to Palestine in June with this delegation, and I did so as a Dakota woman who shares the history and struggle of life under occupation. I come from the place that we call Minnesota Mokoche, or land where the waters reflect the skies. And my people have faced invasion and the theft of our lands, and we have also faced the destruction of our homeland. And anyone who's been to Minnesota might look around and think it looks just fine. What do you mean, destruction? Well, what I mean is that in my homeland, 99% of the prairies have been destroyed. 98% of Minnesota's white pines. 90% of our wetlands. We're losing topsoil 20 times faster than topsoil is being created. We're witnessing the toxification of our waters, air, and land. In addition to the destruction to our homeland, we've also lost our war of resistance against occupation, and I'll explain that in a little bit. In 1862, our people went to war, and we lost. As a consequence of that war, 38 of our Dakota warriors were hanged in what remains the largest mass simultaneous hanging from one gallows in world history. We faced forced marches, the imprisonment of our people, often in concentration camps. We also had our male population subjected to long prison sentences. We faced ethnic cleansing from our homeland. We faced bounties on the scalps of our people. And then After all that, we faced cultural genocide, relentless attacks on our culture and spirituality, much of which was directed at our most vulnerable population, the children. I live the legacy of occupation and settler colonialism. Today, the vast majority of Dakota people still live in exile in both the US and Canada, and those of us who do live in our homeland inhabit about 0.012%, that's 12 thousandths of 1% of our original land base. And it's with that history and that legacy that I went to Palestine and made the connection with the Palestinian struggle. Blatant signs of repression plaster the landscape in occupied Palestine. The apartheid wall, frequent security towers and checkpoints, excessive use of barbed wire are all manifestations of an illegitimate government trying desperately to exert control over a land and people that are not its own. These prominent physical structures powerfully and immediately convey the essence of colonial domination in a way that few other images can. What exists in Palestine is a particular reflection of the combination of a highly technologized or high modern Israeli military and security apparatus and the use of that apparatus to facilitate colonialist aims. It targets the indigenous population for elimination or exclusion, harassment, and subjugation. Tonight, I thought I'd focus on a particularly insidious aspect to this increasingly high-tech manifestation of colonialism in what seems to be an increasing abstraction of the enemy. And when I say abstraction, I by no means am saying that it is less oppressive or that it does not manifest itself in concrete structures or objects. Rather, I mean that the perpetrators of oppression become less identifiable. For example, going through checkpoint 300 between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, we did not cross as US passport holders and instead crossed on foot. This physical structure of oppression had replaced soldiers with guns. As we were herded through long winding corrals like subjugated animals, Zakaria, our host and guide that day, said, "You don't see soldiers, only cameras." Indeed, there were no Israelis visible, only security cameras, turnstiles, regulated by green and red lights, and rooms where our belongings were x-rayed by machines and where orders issued from speakers, all of which signified this abstraction. I was angry, but at whom? The only soldier I actually saw was the one who checked my passport at the very end. This movement toward abstraction is not sudden, nor does it immediately replace the recognizable face of the colonizer, but the identity of the colonizer becomes masked as the perpetrators of settler colonialism, that is, all settlers, become less discernible in the colonial landscape. If we assume that people are the perpetrators of oppression, not the objects they create, the technologies of oppression help distance the perpetrators from the acts of oppression while still allowing them to directly benefit from them. This is particularly insidious because it makes effective resistance against oppression more difficult. In order to wage a resistance war against colonial occupation, one has to recognize what one is resisting. That is, the enemy must be identifiable. As abstractions become more permanent fixtures on the landscape, a sense of normalcy develops around them. If they are not eradicated, new generations are born without personal memories of life of freedom. While serious acts of continuing and ongoing resistance, even intellectual resistance, those future generations will begin to accept what will be framed by the colonizers as an inevitable reality. When colonial expansion is underway, the enemy is easy to recognize. For example, in our first evening in the West Bank, we visited the village of Awarta. They had just experienced 45 days of terror in which their village was under siege by Israeli settlers and military. Even as we spoke with them, they reported that just a few hours before we arrived, settlers had set fire to their wheat crop, attempting to destroy their food production. Awarta council leaders told us of the spring 2011 arrests of 100 women, a tactic used by the military to put pressure on the rest of the village to gain compliance and suppress resistance. They described the arrest of one of their 83-year-old women who was taken into the nearby military camp, interrogated, and forced to sign papers in Hebrew she did not understand. They talked of the beatings, the shootings, the invasion of homes, the theft of resources, and the traumatizing of children. Incredible sadness swept over me when we viewed from a hilltop the encroaching Israeli settlements, which they have seen gradually expand. Awarta elders described the progression from temporary structures to permanent structures as land is confiscated and the colonizers move in. This story was all too familiar, as my ancestors observed the same chain of events in Dakota homeland. In these instances, the enemy is obvious. Soldiers who invade homes, brandishing guns and threats, are the enemy. Settlers who move in and take over Palestinian lands or homes are enemies. Soldiers who kidnap Palestinian women are enemies. Settlers who burn food crops are enemies. In these instances, the enemy has a face. In this phase of physical colonial expansion in what is now the U.S., or the United Snakes of America, as one of my West Coast Indigenous friends calls it, Indigenous people understood who the enemies were. When my Dakota ancestors declared war on the U.S. in 1862, they went to war against the people they could identify by face. Our effective resistance against colonial occupation was largely suppressed by the end of the 19th century, though since that time, Indigenous populations continue to fight colonial intrusions into our remaining reservation lands, especially as corporate and government interests seek to exploit remaining natural resources or use Indigenous lands as dumping grounds for civilization's waste, or, as we've learned in the last few weeks, government agents exploit Indigenous children for state profit. A news story just broke about how the state of South Dakota is currently abducting Dakota and Lakota children in order to add money to the state's coffers through a corrupt social welfare system. The struggle against colonial domination undoubtedly continues, but the nature of resistance has changed since our ancestors fought in the Indian Wars. If the United States government were still in its heyday of expansionist frenzy, as is the state of Israel, and if Indigenous people here were continuing to resist occupation as effectively as the Palestinians, our reservations would likely be experiencing the same level of surveillance and high-tech security as Gaza and the West Bank. But something shifted after our militant physical resistance to occupation ended, and settlers were assured of their physical safety in occupying our lands. Then the task was to maintain colonial domination and to continue to suppress resistance. While European technologies certainly played a role in the period of conquest and colonization, the colonizing process became more abstract as the U.S. government developed effective means to maintain our subjugation. And these often took the form of federal policies, such as the Dawes Allotment Act that reduced our land holdings by 2/3 and broke up our communal societies, and institutions, such as the federally mandated boarding schools that target our children for ethnocide. Systems and institutions such as these became the abstractions against which Indigenous people here continue to struggle, and thus most resistance has taken the form of fighting for recognition of treaty rights or lobbying for federal policy change. Notable exceptions exist, of course. Actions like the occupation of Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, where at least temporary autonomous zones were created, or places like Ganyanka, where Mohawks successfully recovered some of their ancestral land through armed occupation. But 519 of Columbus and more than 2 centuries of American domination, the vast majority of Indigenous peoples in the U.S. have accepted the permanency of the U.S. occupation of our homeland and its existence as a nation-state in spite of its colonial history. Okay, so I want to close with just talking a little bit about fighting back against abstraction. Peter Gelderloos has written that if the Palestinians hadn't made the Israeli occupation and every successive aggression so costly, all the Palestinian land would be seized except for a few reservations to hold the necessary number of surplus laborers to supplement the Israeli economy. And the Palestinians would be a distant memory living in a long line of extinct peoples. Palestinian resistance, including suicide bombings, has helped ensure Palestinian survival against a far more powerful enemy. And, as Albert Memmi has noted, when violence is used by the colonized, even the leftist colonizer becomes unbearably embarrassed. This is something that Palestinian solidarity activists have to get over. Indigenous people under occupation have a right to defend their lands by any means necessary. As scholars and activists, it is our responsibility to provide the intellectual rationale for the most radical of actions. One way that resistance is maintained is through story. About imperialism, Edward Said wrote, "The main battle is over the land, of course, but when it came to who owned the land, who had the right to settle and work the land, who kept it going, who won it back, and who now plans its future, these issues were reflected, contested, and even for a time decided in narrative." One raging narrative battle may be seen in what is perhaps the most abominable abstraction in Palestine, the apartheid wall. Israel has attempted to justify its extreme militarization and repression under the banner of security. But in the context of colonial occupation, this is a farce. When any indigenous population is faced with land theft, occupation, constant encroachment, ethnic cleansing, and other forms of naked repression, resistance to the violence will escalate and the colonized will act in self-defense. The discourse of security employed by Israelis is really about ensuring that the violence proceeds unilaterally, that Israelis can continue invading, stealing, destroying, oppressing, and colonizing while trying to minimize the impact of any defensive actions by Palestinians. Essential to resistance is not allowing the colonial narrative to infiltrate the mind. On our trip, we spoke with dozens of Palestinians who consciously and defiantly rejected the Israeli narrative and committed themselves to the path of truth-telling in the face of oppression. As one of our hosts in Kalkilia said about the wall, "It's a lie what they are talking about, that it's for security. It's not actually security, it's just stealing land." A speaker for one of the women's organizations also summed it up concisely. Israeli is not defending itself, it is defending its occupation. An illegitimate and oppressive power must always use violence and force, or the threat of violence and force, to sustain itself. There is no question that Zionist Jews would not have to fear Palestinian violence if they were not colonizing Palestinian lands. One of our jobs as intellectuals, writers, and activists is to support Palestinians in maintaining their narratives of resistance in an increasingly abstract landscape. We must help ensure that the Zionist narrative loses. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Gerald Lenoir. Gerald is a co-founder of the Priority Africa Network, which advocates for progressive U.S. policies toward Africa and organizes dialogues between African Americans and Black immigrants. He is also on the board of directors of the Interfaith Peace Builders and the director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and he has just returned from Palestine also this summer with the Black Heritage delegation. First delegation to Palestine.
very much. Good evening, everyone. I just want to first thank the sponsors of this event for allowing me to be a part of it. And I especially want to thank Rabab for getting me here. I was in Palestine for the first time 3 years ago. When I came back, I spoke at another event that Rabab had organized here. And so I'm very happy to be back. I'm very happy also to be at this university because, in my mind, this is a premier university in the Bay Area and indeed in this country because of its commitment to social justice. And so, besides the fact that my wife graduated from here in the School of Social Work, I have a great identification with this university and love coming here. I also want to acknowledge this wonderful panel of powerful sisters who, in their own right, contributed so much to social justice in all kinds of ways. And so, being the only man on the panel, I just wanted to say I am just in awe of being on this panel with such powerful women. As I said, I was in Palestine for the first time 3 years ago. I was part of a delegation, a People of Color delegation, organized by the American Friends Service Committee's Third World Coalition and coordinated by Interfaith Peace Builders. I was so moved by what I saw there and what I experienced and what I learned that I came back and I joined the board of Interfaith Peace Builders and began to have conversations about an African heritage delegation. Because I knew that in many ways, many of our leaders in the African American community have been silenced by the pro-Israeli lobby. In many ways, they have been, in some cases, bought off, in some cases, intimidated. And so I felt, and IFPB, Interfaith Peace Builders, felt that it was important to begin to bring African American activists to Palestine, to listen, to learn, and to bring back the word to our communities. During that first delegation, Dean Montero, I don't know if I've ever talked to you about this, but there was a sister delegation in which Paula Montero, Dean Montero's cousin, was on. And so, so we want to try to see if we can get you over there. And so I'm going to call Paula and see if we can work on it. But, so we did come back and we did decide we were going to organize this African Heritage Delegation. I was very proud to be the leader of that delegation. It was Interfaith Peace Builders' 38th delegation in its 10-year history. It was a delegation made up of 14 African Americans from all over the country, from Washington, D.C., from Atlanta, Georgia, from Chicago, as I said, from all over the country. And what we found was that we had a profound experience in terms of our identification with the struggle of Palestinian people. And before I go any further, I just want to read a poem because I think it capsulizes, for me, some of what we felt. It is a poem called Moving Towards Home. It is by our sister June Jordan, who many of you may know because she taught at UC Berkeley. She taught poetry and she taught there for many years. We lost her to cancer in 2002, but her words live on. This is a poem that was written in 1982, and she prefaces the poem from a quote from the New York Times on September 20, 1982, and it was right after the phalangist Israeli massacre of refugees in Beirut. And the quote that she has, it says, "Where is Abdulhadi?" she wailed. "Who will bring me my loved one?" And the poem goes like this. "I do not wish to speak about the bulldozers and the red dirt, not quite covering all the arms and legs. Nor do I wish to speak about the night-long screams that reached the observation post where soldiers lounged about. Nor do I wish to speak about the woman who shoved her baby into the stranger's hands before she was led away. Nor do I wish to speak about the father whose sons were shot through the head while they slit his own throat before the eyes of his wife. Nor do I wish to speak about the army that lit continuous flares into the darkness so that others could see the backs of their victims lined against the wall. Nor do I wish to speak about the piled up bodies and the stench that will not float. Nor do I wish to speak about the nurse again and again raped before they murdered her on the hospital floor. Nor do I wish to speak about the rattling bullets that did not halt on that keening trajectory. Nor do I wish to speak about the pounding on the doors and the breaking of the windows and the hauling of families into the world of the dead. I do not wish to speak about the bulldozer and the red dirt, not quite covering all the arms and legs. Because I do not wish to speak about unspeakable events that must follow from those who dare to purify a people, those who dare to exterminate a people, those who dare to describe human beings as beasts with two legs, those who dare to mop up, to tighten the noose, to step up the military pressure, to ring around civilian streets with tanks, those who dare to close the universities, to abolish the press, to kill the elected representatives of the people who refuse to be purified. Those are the ones from whom we must redeem the words of our beginning, because I need to speak about home. I need to speak about living room, where the land is not bullied and beaten into a tombstone. I need to speak about living room, where the talk will take place in my language. I need to speak about living room, where my children will grow without horror. I need to speak about living room, where the men of my family between the ages of 6 and 65 are not marched into a roundup that leads to the grave. I need to talk about living room, where I can sit without grief, without wailing aloud for my loved ones, where I must not ask, where is Abdulhadi, because he will be there beside me. I need to talk about living room, because I need to talk about home. I was born a black woman, and now I am become a Palestinian. Against the relentless laughter of evil, there is less and less living room, and where are my loved ones? It is time to make our way home. That power and identification that June Jordan expresses in his poem is what we felt in our trip to Israel and Palestine. Just to give you some understanding of what we did and who we saw, just give you a little bit of, we spent the night with families in a Palestinian village of Belin in the West Bank, where the Israeli government had confiscated huge tracts of Palestinian land for illegal settlements, for the apartheid wall, for Israeli-only highways. And we learned a lot about the nonviolent resistance against that wall and some of the battles and some of the organizing that went on. And it was a very powerful experience for us as we sat and had dinner with the family. We stayed overnight in the Dehesha refugee camp that was established in 1948 and talked to generations of Palestinians, youth, elders, and everything in between about how they were dispossessed. And we were struck by the resiliency of the refugees there and some of the history of their nonviolent resistance to the occupation. We walked the streets of East Jerusalem and Hebron and witnessed Israeli soldiers perched on rooftops, armed with semi-automatic rifles, guarding illegal settlements. There we met with Palestinians and Israelis who worked together to protest the presence of the settlements in the occupation. We met with an Afro-Palestinian community in East Jerusalem who shared their experience of oppression as Palestinians and as people of African descent. We met with human rights groups, we met with faith-based groups, we met with the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions National Committee member, staff member. So we got a really good understanding of the occupation and of the resistance to the occupation. And we couldn't help but relate the experience of Palestinians to our own experience as African Americans in these United States. And I just want to read to you, one of our members on our delegation was a sister from Mississippi, Dr. Gloria Brown, who had been part of the struggle against Jim Crow and the struggle for civil rights in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s. And I just want to read to you from one of the blogs that she wrote while we were on the trip. She says, seeing dimensions of discrimination and oppression in Israel-Palestine, the walls, the murder scenes, the unequal funding for education, the class and race separation, the hiring practices, the gender inequity, has caused me to have major flashbacks about growing up and teaching in the state of Mississippi where white was right. As it relates to Israel-Palestine, Jews are right. Despite biblical references to Jews being a chosen people, I know that this is not how God works, and I cannot understand how they can believe they have the right to oppress others or attempting to remain on the land they ought to be able to rightfully claim. So we spent many hours talking about those parallels between our experience of racial segregation and separation, racial oppression, and the oppression of the Palestinian people. And one of the parallels that we also talked about is the apartheid parallel. I spent many years as a leader in the anti-apartheid movement both in Seattle and here in the Bay Area. And what I saw and witnessed and heard about in Palestine is apartheid. And in 1973, United Nations adopted a Convention on Suppression and the Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid and defined it not as a crime limited to South Africa, but as was stated at the time, the crime of apartheid includes similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa. And what we saw was apartheid. Like the situation in South Africa, the confiscation of land, where the best land is for the minority, and people are dismissed from their homes are destroyed. It's a similar situation that we saw in South Africa. The discrimination in terms of the rights of even citizens of Israel, the second-class citizenship of citizens of Israel, the military occupation of communities, speaks to the parallels that we talked about on a nightly basis in Palestine. And there's no secret that during the apartheid days of South Africa's staunchest ally was Israel. Right. Israel provided training, military training for the apartheid troops. They provided them with access to nuclear weapons. They provided them with the vital capital that they needed for the apartheid regime, the loans, and broke all of the UN sanctions against South Africa in terms of the arms embargo. So that parallel for us was very important in terms of our understanding of the crimes against humanity that take place in Palestine. So what we did was we vowed that we would come back and share this information with our communities. and to challenge the way the Israeli lobby is beginning to penetrate the African American community. What we've heard recently is that there's a lot of effort to lure African American students, particularly at the historically black colleges in the South. And there are a group of African American students that are now advocating on behalf of Israel. So we decided that we would come back and do work in our African American communities. And on the table there is a statement from our delegation. And I just want to read from it some of the things that we say we want to do. As a result of our findings and conclusions, we adopted the following resolutions. We call on African Americans and all people of goodwill to support an end to the occupation, including the removal of all Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the dismantling of the apartheid wall, the end to the military and economic blockade of the Gaza Strip, the granting of full equality to all Palestinians and Mizrahi Jewish citizens of Israel, and the recognition and realization of the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced Palestinians. We call for the humane treatment of Palestinian children and adults in the custody of the Israeli Defense Forces and Israeli police, and the release of all political prisoners, and an end to an indefinite detention without trial. We call for the United States government to cease its military aid of $3 billion of our tax dollars annually to Israel in the name of security, which is used to further oppress, harass, maim, and kill Palestinians. We further endorse the international campaign calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel in support of Palestinian freedom and justice and equality. And finally, we call upon U.S. citizens to join interfaith peace builder delegations and travel to Palestine and Israel to learn about the impact of the occupation firsthand. So we know that as the theme of this forum is Palestinians and indivisibility of justice, we know that as long as a single Palestinian is oppressed, that none of us are free. That as long as our U.S. tax dollars go to support the occupation, that we are complicit as a nation in the oppression of Palestinians. We know that, as we learned in the anti-apartheid struggle, that we have power. That we have, if we have the will, we have the power to change U.S. foreign policy. And so we're calling upon our communities to come together to fight for justice for Palestinians. I just want to leave with one more poem. And this is a poem, a very short poem, that I wrote when we were at the Dehesha refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. It's called Red Roofs. Red roofs, the color of blood, dot the stolen hillsides. Walls are erected that scar the sacred land, violating ancient vineyards, separating people from familiar places, cutting off communities, cultures, and commerce. A whole country, an entire people in Bantustan bondage, exploited, evicted, expropriated, expelled, exterminated. In the shadow of the Wailing Wall, Al-Aqsa, and Via Dolorosa. In Hebron, Abraham and Sarah turn in their graves. In Dehesha, children grow up amid unholy terror. Apartheid in the Holy Land. Thank you.
Let's give Mr. Lenoir another round of applause, please. As a little housekeeping, and with all due respect, we want to ask the speakers if we can keep it as close to 15, 20 minutes as possible, only because we want to make sure that we allow time for the 15. Oh, okay, well, because we want to allow time for Q&A from, and have audience participation in a Q&A that will be following the program and the cultural performance. It's my honor to introduce Melissa Garcia. She is currently a doctoral candidate at the American Studies at Yale University and a postdoctoral fellow lecturer in the program of American Studies. She's earned her bachelor's degree from Hunter College at SUNY and a master's degree from Yale University, where she is completing her PhD with a graduate qualification in women's, gender, and sexuality studies. Ms. Garcia's research teaching interests engage the study of the Americas from a hemispheric perspective, integrating visual culture, violence, and cultural memory, feminist and critical race theory, borderlands, and Latina and Latino studies. Please welcome Dr. Melissa Garcia.
Okay. Computer is not working for the visuals. I don't know why, but it just shut down. But I was debating when I was there, looking at the visuals that was showed us, and I thought that what I wanted to show you was it was already part of that. So I was debating whether to go through this or not. But I guess we can work with it. Today I'm truly honored to celebrate with all of you here the vibrant legacy of Professor Edward Said, and a legacy that is envisioned in that Palestinian cultural mural here at San Francisco State. In fact, I see this gathering itself, much like the mural, as a living, effective documentation of public intellectual history, as he called it. That is, that human freedom and knowledge are intertwined. It is in this spirit of underscoring that indivisibility that today I share with you a part of what I saw and what we saw in our visit to Palestine. Perhaps because I studied gender and racial violence in the Mexico-US borderlands. Perhaps because I also study internal borders made invisible by racialization of indigenous people in South America. But perhaps for my own background, I was attuned when I was in Palestine to the regulatory power of that electrified wall that we found wherever we went. Particularly the one that was the part of the wall that crosses Jerusalem. It is not a coincidence, I learned, that the same company, the same Israeli company, AMED, builds both walls, the one in Israel, the one in the US-Mexico border. It is not a coincidence either that the people who are crossing, or the people who are intended to be contained by the wall, are racialized precisely based on their claims for social and economic justice. Here, I'm making the connection between Mexican and other Latino and other immigrants who experience the very process of racialization as they go through this. Chicano scholars and ethnic studies scholars in general for whom the idea of borders is both spatial and historical. Think about Jim Crow, apartheid, internment camps. These scholars have utilized the concept of borders, particularly that of the Mexico-US border, to understand the various overlapping histories of conquest and various empires, as well as the rich cultural identities of those we call border subjects. More recently, however, the figure is involved in relationship to immigration control, human trafficking, smuggling of guns and drugs, etc. Not coincidentally, both military and civilian populations living on the US side of the border or on the Israeli settlement side of that border have taken the role of policing the very crossing of it. Yet perhaps because I also teach and write and work with visual culture, I was quite struck with the sophistication with which the Israeli government controls spatial arrangements in Palestine, something that one can only witness by seeing it. How, for example, the location of the ever-increasing settlements on Palestinian land is strategically planned, not only in terms of economic resources, such as in the grabbing of fertile land or monopolizing access to water, but also in terms of facilitating the policing of the Palestinian populations living nearby. Whether it was on a mountaintop that overlooked a Palestinian village such as in Awarta, or on the upper floors of ancient buildings overlooking a Palestinian market in Hebron, or in the front of a house in which Israeli settlers were living, and then in the back, the family who had been resisting eviction is also living. The borders are mobile. The idea of borders, more than a geometric, static, and ultimately detached idea, comes into play here. Power works in all directions. Power moves. Power is flexible. Borders are also moving in the making. The wall is advancing as we speak. The wall is cutting social spaces as we speak, and crossing, sometimes in the middle of very communal areas, such as the field that kids use for sporting event and playing soccer in one of the cultural centers that we visited, in which the wall was being planned to cut right in the middle of it. Another aspect that for me was interesting in terms of how does this work is the fact that we can look at this idea of borders and flexibility when we're thinking about checkpoints as regulatory sites that are open or closed at any time with no previous notice. You can only know that from local Palestinians who actually, by word of mouth, they learn which checkpoint is open, which checkpoint is safer, which checkpoint, how to get to another city, right, without or minimizing the number of checkpoints. And that can change at any time. This is, of course, for me at least, a tactic that resonated with some of the tactics that our police departments very well know, and that employ in controlling urban populations, especially now that we're thinking about this 99% movement. It's still striking how the techniques, the ways in which the policing work is quite, there is a pattern there, is quite similar. As I said, power is flexible. In the case of Palestine, it adapts to the resistance that Palestinians have. However, the flexibility of these divisions, these borders, is quite material and not strictly metaphorical, as some critics sometimes have alerted us, and rightly so. Scholars of post-colonial and colonial studies have pointed out the changing dimension of geopolitical borders, and thanks to the contributions of historians who insist on the permanence and resilience of these colonial legacies, We know how the conquest of land was material, ideological, and cultural when we're talking about in historical terms. Whether it was under the ideology of European progress, modernity, manifest destiny, or civilizing missions, historians of conquest and empire have demonstrated the power of robbing sacred ways of life. And here I'm using sacred in a broader sense, as in the sense of communion, of gathering, of cohesiveness in a community, such as in known practices that we learn from ethnic studies and colonial studies, the building of churches on top of sites that were sacred to indigenous populations, or arranging the public plaza for gatherings in front of the military and the religious buildings. However, some of us sensed, when we were there, an eerie conflation of time when we're thinking about the historical parallels. We were witnessing it. This was not revisionist history. And I should say that during those days, actually was instrumental in forcing us as a delegation to the point of uneasiness sometimes, to think seriously about the logic of settler colonialism, one that counts on the permanent erasure of the past, one that doesn't stop. I spent a couple extra days after the delegation left and visited an ancient Palestinian cemetery located in West Jerusalem in front of the soon-to-be Waldorf Astoria Hotel. What we witnessed there was the destruction, the constant, ordinary, with no fanfare, destruction of tombs. And we saw this as one stage of colonization in this very sacred side of Palestinian memory. I mean, when we think about sacredness, and that's what I insist, and to think about sacredness in a broader sense, it's our own responsibility to the ones who came before us and the ones who are ahead, right? And one way in which groups, communities remember that, make their histories, is precisely by honoring their dead. But it is ironic here because this was happening as we were there. And also, the irony is that the Israeli government plans to build a museum of tolerance on these very same grounds. I was able to take some pictures, learn a bit about its history, but that, of course, will probably soon be erased as well. Even the dead are under occupation. Dismantling historical distortion and erasure in relationship to present-day injustice is the very premise that informs ethnic studies. Knowledge and freedom, as I had said, in the canon of the public intellectual, right, are all part of the same matrix. But here, I bring this experience of the cemetery among the many ones that we shared when we were there, and we keep sharing, and we keep remembering, and every time we look at the pictures, we remember something else, because that's what pictures do. They stand as a document of a moment that passed when we were there. But also, as pictures, we know that that is just a moment that is going to be lost within the ordinariness of life. So when we were there, it was very useful, or at least for me, it was very, it helped me to understand other ways of knowledge, right? And that's why I am really excited to be here thinking about Dr. Said and his living legacy, right? Because one of talking about the dead and the sacred and the living, right? And being on that constant, with that constant thread. The first night that we arrived there, we went to the village of Awarda. And among the many things that we learned from community leaders and informally, at the very end, it was getting dark. We were all tired, right? Most of us were already ready to go in the bus. And some of us were just saying our goodbyes or taking a last picture or something like that. And then we met, and we met this woman who had lost her son to the Israeli military, the Israeli soldiers, not long ago. And she has, I don't remember the exact number, but she had a few sons and daughters, and she said that how another one was in prison, they were being threatened, and how the military would go to that house, in particular, after their son was killed, to threat. Unannounced, of course, right? But what was for me, this was just one story among the many that we heard, but what for me was striking and it's lingering in my memory is the insistence that that woman, who obviously we could only understand through a translation, but I remember explicitly how this woman, along with her husband, they were so insistent on telling us the story, right? It was not just the story as in a factual thing, my son was killed. They were repeating and repeating, and what I could gather for the body language was this knowledge, this understanding that this story needed to be told, right? And the sense of urgency, and the fact that when she was telling this story and aware of all, right, the translation issues and many other mediations in there, right, at that moment, I remember that she brought her kids, and she's like, yeah, here's my kid, here's another one, these are my kids. It was like the whole act of showing, right, what she knew, and that she very well knew that was, like that cemetery in front of the Waldorf Astoria was very much in jeopardy, was very much about to be erased in the midst of so many other stories. And I saw that she was, in doing this, she was making sure that the memory of her son, that her family, right, that her experience, their experience as a family mattered. And it was the first day, the first night, and we were all leaving. And I remember someone said, let's just go. And she will not say goodbye. She will not say goodbye. She refused to say goodbye. She was saying, she was repeating, so in the act of acknowledging that there is a big void, that things become invisible, and she knows that. And for me, it was such a inspiration in the sense that, as Edward Said would say, right, she was very aware that that knowledge that she was trying to transmit with all the obstacles in between was so intertwined with human freedom.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Again, just want to remind you all that GUPS and the PYM, as well as a table here doing silk screening for bandanas, which is for free. It's images of Handela, and I believe they have some other images. Actually, I would like to talk a bit about Nancy Hernandez, who's right over there. Nancy, could you wave to the audience? Nancy has been an incredible organizer in our community for years. She is a member of Estria Foundation, which does a lot of social justice work around water rights. Whether it's Oakland or Gaza, she's been doing work for years. She just returned from Gaza this summer, where she was working on various mural projects. She's been to Palestine several times, and she's been doing a lot of mural projects with our people back there that really focuses on cultivating the sense of arts as being intertwined with our struggles for freedom and social justice. So I want to give a round of applause to Nancy and thank her and her team for coming out to the silk screening. So the next speaker, of course, is no stranger to us. Dr. Angela Davis was a participant of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Delegation. Through her activism and scholarship over the last decade, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Dr. Davis has taught at many different universities. She's currently and has spent 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program at Feminist Studies. She is the author of 8 books, and she's traveled the world giving public lectures and speeches, and she draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Angela Davis.
Everyone? First, I would like to acknowledge the Ohlone people, the original inhabitants of the land on which we gather this evening. And I would like to thank Rabab Abdulhadi for having organized this event, and all of the other sponsors and organizers, marking the 4th anniversary of the Palestinian cultural mural honoring the late Professor Edward Said. Now I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and I will set a timer to make sure I don't go over. After which Professor Gina Dent, who will be introduced, will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we want to share 5 minutes of our time each, showing some images, if we can get the images to show on the screen. Now, I spent the entire day yesterday in Oakland in the Occupy movement. I was asked to speak to help kick off the day, and then I walked with thousands and thousands and thousands of people down to the port, and it was an amazing experience. I don't know whether I've ever experienced that sense of unity and happiness in Oakland, especially people from the older generation, I mean my generation. When I saw them, they would say, "It's happening, it's happening, finally." But I want to tell you a story about my morning talk. I said a few words, general comments about what this movement needs to be addressing. And I said at one point, as we occupy Wall Street, as we occupy Oakland, we should be opposed to the occupation of Palestine. And I think most people applauded. But afterwards, a woman came up to me and told me that she had been following me for years, what a lot of people say, and I respect you, and I agree with you. And I was really feeling great about your talk this morning until you said we should be opposed to the occupation of Palestine. And she said to me, to oppose the occupation of Palestine is to favor the destruction of Israel. So we got into a big argument out there at the occupation site. And it became clear to me after a while that there was not going to be a resolution. That she had so imbibed Zionist ideology that it didn't make any sense to argue anymore. So I said, I'm sorry, this is not happening. and I think I'm going to need to move on to something else. But the reason I point this out is because I do believe, and the trip to Palestine really reinforced that belief, that those of us who are involved in social justice movements have to make a special effort to guarantee that solidarity with Palestine is on every progressive agenda in this country. And I think that the Occupy movement offers us an opportunity, and especially given the language that's being used, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Philadelphia, Occupy Oakland, Occupy LA, Unoccupy New Mexico, right? Unoccupy Puerto Rico. That is what the movement has designated itself in Puerto Rico. And so I think it offers us an opportunity to perhaps transform the language of occupation by expressing our solidarity with those who have been victimized by military occupation, and especially in Palestine. I've mentioned several times talking about this, that what comes to mind is the image of young Israeli, well, they look like boys and girls, with huge rifles strapped across the front of their chest, their fingers always on the trigger. And I can tell you that I didn't expect to feel such fear. I really didn't. I have been involved for many, many years in Palestinian solidarity movements. As a matter of fact, I often point out that it's since my freshman year in college at Brandeis University. And I learned Palestinian solidarity from my Jewish friends and classmates at Brandeis, interestingly enough. But I think that that also the prison abolitionist movement, this is actually my theme for this evening, to talk about prisons, and I have 3 minutes and 48 seconds left. So let me say that what struck me during the visit of our Indigenous and women of color feminist delegation was the pervasiveness of carceral technologies. And I came to recognize that if we are calling for the abolition of prisons within the US, we have to address the extent to which those carceral technologies have been used against people all over the world. Now, I would have said before, primarily within prisons, but of course, Gaza, as Omar Barghouti has pointed out in his book on boycott, divestment, and sanctions, that Gaza is the largest open-air prison in the world. And being on the West Bank and seeing the wall and seeing the gun towers and seeing the, all of the barbed wire, it felt like we were inside of a prison. And so for those of us who have been calling for the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment for many, many years, and I kind of date that movement back 40 years ago to the Attica Uprising in 1971, it is really important for us to make the connections with the Palestine solidarity movement abolition of prisons would also mean abolition of the occupation of Palestine. And so let me say that when we emphasize that prison abolition is only possible if we can envision the transformation of larger society in ways that banish the necessity of incarceration from economic and social landscapes. So we're talking about education and healthcare and jobs and so forth. It seems to me that this dialectic of abolition becomes so much more compelling when we look at the situation of Palestinians in Israeli prisons. And when we look at the insidious classificatory systems that relegate the majority of Palestinians arrested by the Israelis to the status of security prisoners, and the categorization of Palestinians as security prisoners allows for treatment that is much, much harsher than for non-security prisoners. I wanted to say a few words, and I'll just evoke this, a gesture toward it. The hunger strike that has been going on periodically here in California prisons, Pelican Bay, and then in places like Calipatria. And it was interesting that a few weeks ago, the hunger strike was going on here in prisons in California, and there was also a hunger strike in there was also a hunger strike, that was my timer going off, telling me that I used up my 10 minutes, there was a hunger strike in Israeli prisons. 2,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails waged a hunger strike. And so finally, let me say that the impact of this this visit to Palestine, I've still not fully expressed the depth of our experiences there and how it was life-changing in many ways for me. But I will say that I understand more than ever before how important it is to call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Which is calling for an end to the occupation of Palestine and of all Arab land occupied in 1967. The recognition of the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens in Israel to full equality, and the respect and promotion of the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes as stipulated by the United Nations. And so let me urge all of you, if you have not yet signed on to BDS, please do so and encourage people, particularly those who were involved in the boycott movement against South Africa. Let people know that we have to isolate the state of Israel in the same way that we were able successfully to isolate and bring down the apartheid state in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Another round of applause for Dr. Angela Davis. As an associate professor of feminist studies, history of consciousness, and legal studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, she also serves as the director of the Institute for Advanced Feminist Research at UCSC and principal investigator for the University of California Multi-Campus Research Group on Transnationalizing Justice. Dr. Gina Dent serves as a member of both the Council and the Executive Committee of the American Studies Association. She is editor of the Black Popular Culture, 1993 in New York Press, and author of articles on race, feminism, popular culture, and visual art. Her forthcoming book, Anchored to the Real, Black Literature in the Wake of Anthropology, is a study of the consequences, both disabling and productive, of social science's role in translating Black writers into American literature. Her two current book projects grow out of her work as an advocate for human rights and prison abolition. Prison as a Border on Prisons and Popular Culture and Movement in Black and Red, The Life of Charlene Mitchell, and an oral history and memoir. Please welcome Dr. Gina Dent.
So I want to thank you all for having stayed this long, and I want to acknowledge our presence on Ohlone land, and I want to thank Waz for reminding us of that necessity, as Melissa pointed out many times, and also thank many of my friends in Australia who first taught me that practice. So I also really want to thank Rabab for the incredible work she did to bring together this delegation of rather feisty feminist studies folks. We weren't feisty? Real? Oh, too feisty, yeah. That was an incredible trip, and I want to begin because I only have my few minutes, but I have to say that I was also incredibly moved to see this mural of Edward Said. Edward Said was my professor when I was in graduate school, and I don't often like to talk about my training as a graduate student in public, and I have resisted the urge in most places to speak about his influence. But I found myself our first morning in Nablus at the park, which had recently been built. And I want you to understand the pride that people in Nablus had in that park. Because as Waz has explained to us, the issue of land for those who live under occupation is obviously a very serious one. And to imagine being able to have a park with greenery, which required access to water and requires the time for people to build it and requires some ability to protect it, was an astonishing thing. So we had our first breakfast that morning at the park, way up in the hills. And it was a beautiful morning where representatives from all of the political parties and also the women's movement were there to greet us and to be introduced. So that morning when I introduced myself to that audience, I acknowledged that Edward Said was my professor. And I also acknowledged that he was the second man in my life who had, as a Palestinian, talked to me about the Palestinian struggle. But I also mentioned that he was a person that I argued with almost more than anyone else. And what I was asked, of course, was, well, why were you arguing with him? With the assumption that, of course, I was arguing with him about the issue of Palestine, which was actually never the case. It was about mostly other things, like gender and the politics of culture, which I think he would be happy to have me raise today, because he was the kind of scholar and thinker who always wanted to be engaged in an argument, who always wanted you to take a position, for you to take him on, for you to challenge him, for you to read deeply, for you to ask questions and to think. And I will really, and I'm getting more emotional than I meant to, I will really also never forget the fact that he was this incredibly warm human being who would see, especially students of color, in the halls of the university and touch us, hold our hand and ask how we were doing and look us in the eye. Never ceased to answer email up until the month before his death. with the signature Love Edward. So I think about that, and I couldn't help but think about him every day that I was in Palestine. So I wanted to acknowledge him here and to thank all of you who were involved in the movement to create the mural, because it's an incredible honor to him. So we went to Palestine, and I went to Palestine with the intention of building solidarity with two movements and two communities, with prison abolitionists and those, especially African Americans, who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I was, of course, also a part of a feminist delegation, and so I was also interested in connecting feminist and queer movements who are often struggling with the pink-washed image of Israel as the democratic emblem of the Middle East. And I hope all of you in this room understand what I mean by pink-washing. Is that clear? Do we know what that means? Yeah.
Tell us.
No?
Tell us.
So yeah, I'll tell you. Okay, and we can talk about this beaming question and answer. Pinkwashing refers to the cleansing of the practices of the Israeli state through their ostensibly liberal, constitutional, and democratic offering of civil rights. So, for example, the protection of gays and lesbians in marriage, or the, as people were telling us about, the support of rights for women, for example. All of this, of course, not considering what it might mean to think about an intersection between gender, sexuality, and citizenship or color. So that pinkwashing, that cleaning of the work of the Israeli state through their promotion of the civil rights for some is what we were wanting to challenge. But I wanted to be a part of this delegation to be able to think about not only the current situation and the horrors of occupation and the incredible use of imprisonment as part of the project of occupation, but also to think about, as I often try to do, what an imagined future would be after the liberation of Palestine. What would happen in a free state? Everywhere we went, we saw how incarceration was used as a strategy, including for young children. I mean, I'll never forget when we met a boy of 11 years who had been inside a jail 3 times in that 1 year. I mean, it's hard to imagine what kind of a future that boy would be thinking he would have in store. And everywhere we went, people were both proud to mention that they had spent time in prison, and everywhere we went, people acknowledged the significance of those who had suffered by having been inside prisons. But I know from looking at the historical situations in other parts of the world, including our own, that often after the resistance struggle has ended, the relationship to the prison changes. And those who have been a part of resistance movements, who were honored for that struggle and for the time they spent inside, suddenly are transformed into those who are the ones who have specifically in and of themselves violated the norms of the culture, or those who become the new incarcerated population are no longer perceived in the same way as proud people who have served, or at least as someone who could deserve the same rights as anyone else. I learned this especially during my time in South Africa, and I've been several times. The first time I went was just after apartheid ended, and I remember that people were so incredibly proud of the movement and so incredibly happy. And at that time, there was very little focus in their culture on incarceration and on crime. there was a lot of focus on how people were assisting each other and how they were helping each other to get by. And just a few years later, I went to visit again and found myself in debates with several people who were in the government there, whom I knew or whom friends of mine knew, and had been involved in struggles for many years. And they were busy building prisons. They were building them sometimes with the assistance of international corporations that are sometimes located here, like the Corrections Corporation of America. And these people with whom we were arguing were sometimes unaware of the consequences of building all of those new cells. Because for them, the project of building these prisons was a temporary one. What they suggested was that once they eradicated poverty, they would find a way to decarcerate. They would find an end to the need to use the prisons. But what we as prison activists were trying to explain is that once those prisons were built, they would never go away. Just a couple of years later, I returned to South Africa one more time for a conference ostensibly on prisons, organized, I thought, and Angela and I were both there, with prison abolition in mind. And yet the entire conference turned into a conference focused not on the disarticulation of crime and punishment, but on crime as the biggest problem in South Africa. So rather than talking about prisons and liberation, we were talking about the need to control crime. That happened in only a period of 10 years. So in Palestine, I was very alert to this memory of South Africa, a country that I love very much, and wanted to think about this in terms of the possible future. And so I just want to end by suggesting that in my conversations with people, attorneys who worked in the very, very complicated, multi-layered legal system inside of occupied Palestine, which requires those who are trying to represent people to understand the inner workings of several different systems of law simultaneously. Because perhaps some of you know that if you are Palestinian and you are charged, you do not know if you will be charged under Jordanian law or Ottoman law or a colonial legacy of the British protectorate or under Israeli law. You may find yourself under an entire network of laws that all appear to be challenging your existence in that place. And so, working and speaking as we were with people who had been inside and who had acknowledged in that culture the importance of resistance, who had even inside of universities created special scholarships for those who had been to prison, I wanted to imagine also that a free Palestine would be critical of the prison industrial complex, and that in a free Palestine we might imagine a future where that ambivalence that I saw now in a nationalist project that is thinking about its own state with curiosity, sometimes as a challenge, and with the idea that it will not be like other states. That in that context, we might be able to imagine a free Palestine and a place where abolition of prisons has become the norm. Thank you. Just a couple of minutes. We just wanted to show you some of the images that we gathered from the many different photos that we were able to take on the trip. And these are the ones that we chose to demonstrate the relationship of the physical landscape to the project of incarceration as we saw it. So that, therefore, the analogy between the prison and the Palestinian situation can be seen. This was in Qalqilia. These are images of the wall. And you'll see there that the wall was built through a farmer's farm, and so his crops were actually now divided. On the other side of the wall, one of the new highways had been built, and these highways connect Israelis and Israeli settlements, so that Palestinians are using a system of tunnels often, while Israelis are using the highways that have been built above. And these highways, when it rains, also spill water, the overflow water, onto the land where the farmer maintains his crops.
Yeah, there are actually holes in the wall. You can see those holes there. And those holes allow the water to come through to the other side so that the farmers who have planted crops there will have their lands completely flooded during the rains. It's so, I mean, it's just unimaginably horrible. And this is also in Calquilla. We're basically in someone's backyard and in a place where you can see here that there are plants to be planted, and this is a small plot, garden plot.
We missed it.
There's something wrong with it.
Technical.
Yeah,
All right, we're going to keep going. You've heard about the checkpoints.
But the wall is so ugly. It destroys a landscape that's so beautiful. So, you know, it's not just the security purposes, but the aesthetic impact it has. You know, on people who before were able to see beautiful land with lots and lots of olive trees. I was so struck by the olive trees there. And now they look at these walls and this checkpoint. And this is in Jerusalem. And this is an entrance to Israel from Calquilla. This is still Calquilla, I think, isn't it? Yeah, it's where workers go in daily. And farmland that belongs to Palestinian is on the other side of this barrier. And we spoke to farmers who are literally unable to tend their own land and to harvest their own land because the gates are only open a couple of hours every day. I think we saw this in your images, was. This is an apartment building where settlers have moved in, and where you see the Israeli flags, that is where settlers are living, so the military knows not to attack those particular apartments. It's so insidious. And this is, Melissa was talking about our visit with the family who had been evicted from this place that is now taken over by settlers.
If you're shopping in Hebron, then you will be shopping under the eyes of this guy here who's prepared to shoot you at any moment.
Yeah, we were in the market and all of a sudden looked up and this is what we saw.
You want to explain it? So this is part of the market in Hebron that's actually still open. And because Palestinians are shopping in this market, Israeli settlers who have built their settlements, and they are a population of, by the way, 700 out of the almost 200,000 people who are inhabitants of Hebron. The military, of course, are there protecting the 700 against the 190 something. And those settlers are nonetheless, despite their privileges, so angry at the Palestinians, who also still live there, that they hurl garbage at them and sometimes throw acid through the coverings that were designed to protect Palestinians below. So that's just some of the garbage.
You know, there's so many things we found it so difficult to believe. And I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, which at the time of my youth was the most segregated city in the entire United States. And I cannot remember it being as bad as what we witnessed in Palestine. And especially when we saw the garbage and not being able to walk down a street. This is a checkpoint in a street. You see the military there, and we're walking through the checkpoint. And at some point, oh yes, here.
I mean, the other thing that I think would be helpful in terms of our organizing inside the United States is our ability to help people read the signs of the occupation. And one of the things that was so astonishing for us was the sophisticated technologies. So Angela just mentioned the South, and of course everyone here is used to looking at those images of the signs that say colored and white. And we immediately know what that means. So the signs that we saw throughout occupied Palestine did not say Jews and Arabs. They would say no one can come through unless you're in an authorized vehicle. And most of us here, seeing that, wouldn't quite understand what that meant. In this case, that meant that only vehicles with Israeli license plates could go through this street, which meant this street was effectively closed to Palestinians who actually had to walk on a path above, and were not allowed to drive cars to shop, but had to walk through the streets.
And of course, with the color coding of the license plates, Israeli license plates are yellow. And so cars with those license plates are able to have access to all of the roads, including inside the West Bank, where there are freeways, highways built only for settlers. This is a detour that Palestinians were required to make in order to continue in the direction of the street, which was barred to Palestinians. So we followed that path. We are above the street. You can see it below. We saw this gate that's, you can read it, Gas the Arabs.
Signed JDL.
And the people whose home this gate had been situated in had gotten a new gate, but they placed this gate on the other side of the path so that people would be able to see it. And I will just continue.
This is Deshe. This is actually outside of Deshe. You heard about Deshe earlier, refugee camp. And I think another thing to mention that might help people to understand a little bit about what's going on in Palestine here is that when I expected to be going to a refugee camp, I thought of it as a temporary structure. I mean, my imagination of what a refugee camp would look like and feel like was quite different from what I actually experienced there. These are camps where people have been living for generations. So children and grandchildren have only ever lived inside of these camps, and these camps are, in a sense, small cities. In fact, Deshe was actually walled off completely, with the exception of a small gate, for a period of many years. So the previous slide is the gate that was used to exit and enter during the time when it was entirely closed off. But now you might be able to see that the symbolic keys are hanging. So the keys inside, so now it's being used as a display of those keys, and those keys, as we heard earlier so profoundly, are a symbol of the right to return.
So we thought we would end this with some hopeful messages. So we saw you're now entering free Deshe. And this is some of the graffiti on this wonderful graffiti on the wall. And this one, of course, says, "I have a dream, and yes, we can." Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce the last but not least presenter of the evening. She serves as the Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies, Race and Resistance Studies, and Senior Scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative, also known as AMED, in the Historic College of Ethnic Studies here at San Francisco State. She has received her BA from SUNY Hunter and her MA, her Master's in Philosophy, and a PhD from Yale University. She is a recipient of numerous awards. She is published in both Arabic and in English. Her most recent work includes the co-edited anthology Arab and Arab American Feminism, Gender, Violence, and Belonging. She is a firm believer in the power and impact of collective work. She has participated in numerous collaborative projects, including most recently as a co-founder and member of the editorial collective of the Islamophobia Studies Journal, a peer-referenced online publication and resource. Excuse me. She has taught at 8 international sites of higher education, including Yale, Hunter College, SUNY New York University, the American University in Cairo. She has also participated in the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco, and she is also was on the San Francisco Mayor's Committee for the first Arab Heritage Month that was held in 2009. She was also the one who organized and had the vision for the first delegation of Indigenous and women feminist delegation that recently went to Palestine. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi.
Thank you, Ame, and thank you all for coming. And I really want to just take a couple of minutes from my time myself also, taking a cue from Angela. I want to thank everybody who made this event possible, because I think everybody who's sitting here thinks that this event made itself, but I want to let you know that we are working all on volunteer basis. You really need to know this, because I'm using this occasion to ask for your support, for the support of our community, for AMED. So we do want your money. We want your money, and we want your bodies, and we want your voices, and we want you to support us in putting this program to practice. I mean, this is really important. I also want to thank my sisters and my comrades and my comrades, including Gerald, because I think, because I have a different vantage point from what you've heard. I'm a Palestinian. I'm born and raised in Palestine. So it was very interesting for me to be actually going there and leading a delegation of people who are going to be expressing solidarity with Palestine. And I've always insisted that I don't babysit and I don't take people on solidarity tourism. People want to go there, they have to be involved with the process. And so I just want to make sure that we thank, the font is very small, but that's because we have a lot of people working to make this program a success. And you will hear more from other people. I want to just mention a few things that, not and flag some of the issues that my colleagues, my sisters and brothers have mentioned from my perspective. So the first day we were in the first day they arrived. I was there 2 days earlier. When we went to Hawarta. Recently, now is the olive season in Palestine, the olive picking season. This is the time that farmers pick their olives in order for them to turn it into oil or olives and sell it and live with it. And just so you would note, last week, the settlers attacked Hawarta again. And they don't just attack Hawarta. I think somebody showed a picture on the wall of they have wild pigs that the settlers, they let go against the Palestinian farmers. So they will attack the farmers. So the farmers would leave, and the settlers either burn the olive harvest or they steal it. So this stuff is going on. The next, I don't want to talk a lot about the whole question of oppression. I want to talk about what are some of the things that came when the two communities communities of indigenous communities and communities of color from the US encountered and interacted with the Palestinians. So the first day, as everybody spoke about the Sama Nablus event, which none of us in Nablus ever knew because it was always closed, so they just opened it up, the Israelis as a goodwill gesture to the Palestinian Authority, but it's another topic. We went to Sama Nablus with everybody in the city. The mayor came, the vice governor, it was everybody, and we were actually surprised because it was Friday morning, who would go out. And the first person who spoke, of course, was Waziyatawin. And Waziyatawin, because we wanted to make sure that the indigenous person speaks first. And as a Palestinian, you know, we understand what that means. And after Waz finished speaking, Uhud Yaish, who is the president of the Arab Feminist Union, she raised her hand to speak. She said, translate, and you know, some of us, me and other people were translating, and she said, Ya Allah, bahis fiki, I feel you. And you know, we were trying to, she said, I can't believe that there are people in other parts of the world who are actually experiencing the same suffering, and they're also struggling as well. It makes me sad to know that you are oppressed, but it makes me happy to know that we are all struggling and we're all here to stay. This is somebody who hasn't really traveled to the US and so on, but she's an activist. For this, I'm saying this story because I really want to emphasize the whole critique of this Occupy business. I mean, I really think we need to change the language. For Occupy Wall Street, you know, Wall Street, you know what Wall Street was, the wall to actually separate the settlers from the native people, right? It's exactly like the apartheid wall and the wall on the Mexico and so on. But if you want to occupy Wall Street as the site of the financial markets that's bleeding, sucking the blood out of people's lives, okay. But why you want to occupy our communities? Why you want to occupy Oakland? I mean, people they can be a little bit more creative and not catch one slogan and continue doing it because we're very allergic. The minute we hear occupation, I've seen all Palestinian writers, they always put it in quotes. They say, the occupation movement is kind of like very hard for us to even be in support, and you agree with the 99% is wonderful, but the Occupy business is really, really problematic. And we need to all, as everybody has spoken, wage a big struggle against it. The second memory I remember is when we went to Dent, which Angela and Gina ended on, the one before, and there was Hamdallah. And there was Hamdallah everywhere. You know, Hamdallah, the symbol that is not supposed to be on the Palestinian mural at San Francisco State University because it is so threatening to the huge power of the State of Israel with all its military and nuclear bombs and so on. This little boy. And it's very interesting because the other day I was looking up Hamdallah stories because we're coming up to the mural anniversary. And I heard an interview with Tamim Barghouti, the Palestinian poet. And he was telling the reporter, he said, you know, when I was 7 years old, we were living in Prague. They were in exile, he and his family. And Najil Ali, the artist who drew Hamdallah, came to visit them. And he told him, I don't want you to draw Hamdallah for me. He was 7-year-old. With this torn clothes, no shoes, you know, the hair is not combed and so on. I want you to give me a Hamdallah who's neat, you know, and have the hair tie and the clothes wearing shoes. And he said, Najil Ali told me, when Palestine is free, I will dress Hamdallah for you and I'll comb his hair. And he said that he actually used that image of Hamdallah for the first cover of his book. This is what Hamdallah meant. So we had an artist with us, Ayoko Chinzira from Spelman College in Atlanta. And she kept saying, what is this symbol? Come and translate. So, and they had it all over Hamdallah, everywhere there is Hamdallah and writings. I mean, they even recreated the whole cartoons. You know, sometimes there were a lot of writings on the cartoon. It wasn't just one word. It's a whole text, you know. And Najil Ali was very creative. So I was translating and so on. So then when we had this open forum at Najah University with the people in Nablus, and they invited everybody, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. And so Ayoko, and she goes by Ayo. She goes up and she said, "What's the name of this little boy? The little boy who's..." So everybody, of course, in the audience said, "Hamdallah." Everybody knew. And one of the Palestinian women prisoners, Yassar, who was there in the beginning and so on, she got up, interrupted everybody, and gave her like Hamdallah chain. I'm saying all of this stuff because there was this kind of connection that was going on. But to me, one of the, so this is, the other story that had happened was when Angela introduced herself at Nablus, at Sama Nablus. She said, you know, when I was in prison, and everybody of course knew that she was one of the most wanted FBI wanted people. And you know, in Palestine, everybody loves people who've been in prison. So it's kind of bad in honor. Nobody wants to stay away from you. Everybody wants to come shake your hand. How was it? And then other prisoners will come and compare experiences. What did you do? When did you have the hunger strike? How thick were the mattresses? Did you go to isolation? I mean, people, there is like this whole, you know, culture and existence. So Angela was saying, she introduced herself and she said that one of the things that gave her strength and kept her going in her 18-month imprisonment on the charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Right? Yeah. Nobody flinched, by the way, when you said that. No. There was a letter that was sent to her, a letter of solidarity from Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. 2 days later, we were going to Jerusalem, and we descended from the bus at the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross in order to visit and express solidarity with the members of the Palestinian Legislative Council, who Israel wants to expel, deport from Jerusalem, because they dared run for seats in the Palestinian legislature when Jerusalem is supposed to be an Israeli city, not for Palestinians, not for Palestinians, only for Jews, and they want to expel them. So these men went and actually have been living for over a year. July 1st was the first year anniversary. For over a year in the headquarters of the ICRC. Because if they get out, that's a sanctuary, Israel would expel them. We came down the bus. And as we came down the bus, one of the people who met us, some of you may know who he is, Yaqub Ode. He's a former Palestinian prisoner who was released in 1985 in an exchange of prisoners. And as I introduced them to each other, Yaqub turned and said to Angela, Angela, so I hear that the letter we sent you was helpful. He was one of the people who drafted that letter. I'm not going to say, I actually asked permission from Angela to tell the story. But it was the fact that this letter was written inside Israeli prisons by the leadership of the Palestinian prison movement. You know, and they all come together, and people who know the prison culture, they know what's going on. They drafted the letter, they smuggled it out of the prison, and it was at the time the Palestinian special security prisoners were under very tight control by the Israelis. To their families outside, the families outside in Palestine under occupation, smuggled it outside of the country, probably through Jordan, and then Jordan is not the most open country, as people know, right? There's hopefully, there will be a revolution sometime there. Then it went across the seas to the United States to be smuggled by people and family who knew Angela into the prison in the US. This is another story. There is the story of the border that's closed, that locks people in, the Wall Street, the apartheid wall, the wall of death, and there is also the story of the ways in which things and people can travel, so solidarity expressions. So that, to me, it was like one of the kind of like, moments that were happening. I think and I will tell you one more story that, actually, let me say it in a minute. Okay. Yeah, I'm okay, I have a few minutes left. So I cannot violate my own rule. So, one of the things that was really, we kept making promises. Every time we went somewhere in Palestine, when we visited Nabil in Sheikh Jarrah, who's 80 years old woman, whose house is taken over by the Israelis, and who got beaten by settlers, and who got beaten up, who was pushed around and so on, and who lives in a very small part in her house. 80-year-old, and she said, I'm not leaving, I'm staying, I'm not leaving. We made promises to her. We made promises to Abed. Angela and Gina showed that the garbage that's coming from on top of the Hebron market, which is mostly closed. But Abed, some of the stuff there was feces and urine bags. I mean, this is what the settlers throw. And Abed's son, he insists to stay there, and he has a shop that he sells Palestinian kafiyas and so on. I mean, not a lot of business. Like they're killing the old city of Hebron. And his son was attacked by the settlers, and his eye is blind. We made promise to Abed. We made promise to everywhere we went that we will come and we'll do something. And for me, it was the statement that the delegation wrote, that we were driving from one place to the other, and like one time the iPad was on Angela's knees, one time it goes to Waz, one time it goes to Gina, one time it goes to Chandra Mohanty, who was with us, and sometimes they're running around all of us to see what we think and so on, all the time, you know, sitting and writing. And when the statement came out, to me that was the ultimate sign of solidarity, because we made the promise. Because we said to people, we will do something, we will remember what you do, what happened to you, people in our Nabil and so on. But I want to end on a couple of things. When we were in Nablus at that open forum, and where Ayo got the Hamdallah from Yassar, and where we found out that one of our colleagues actually marched with Martin Luther King, Beverly Shafar, she was in the civil rights movement. I had asked the people who organized, I said, can you bring Jamilat Nablus? People know who Jamilat Nablus is? Okay, so in 1968, 69, there were a whole bunch of young women. I mean, a lot, almost 18. I was very little, but I remember everybody talking about it. They were all arrested by the Israelis. And what had happened, they did exactly, how many of you have seen the Battle of Algiers, the film? Okay, so you know this is the same. Okay, Jamila means beautiful, and Jamilat Nablus, they were like, I mean, apparently they were stunning. I don't know. I didn't know them. But they were released, okay, see? I'm finishing. They were released also in the same prisoner exchange in 1985, but they spent time in jail from 1968, 69, all the way to 1985. And among them, Amal Hanbali, Maryam al-Shakhshir, whom when I went to do my field research, I interviewed, because this is women who were taking part of the movement and so on, and there is the whole discussion that women don't participate, or they are seduced by the movement, or they are duped by the movement, or they are used by the movement. There's all these things, and my students would know what I'm talking about. But so I asked them to come, and after they all came and asked questions and so on, and then I don't know if you remember what happened when we went out. We came out. We finished, the forum finished, and everybody said hello and so on, and they're all writing their books, memoirs, prisoners, former prisoners. And they hold hands. Maryam al-Shakhshir, Amal Hanbali, Nail al-At'oud, Suad Ghanim, all these women who are like leaders of the movement, you know, they're leaders of the movement there. And they start thinking, we shall overcome. And I swear, they know every single word to the song that a lot of us don't remember. I mean, they weren't doing it in the kumbaya kind of way, let's hold hands and everything. No, because this was a very critical group that had asked very difficult questions, and we also raised issues, kind of like we need to have a discussion with, because this was not a delegation that was only going there just to see. This was people who actually already knew about the sense of justice, and they wanted to interact in concrete terms and interact with the people who were there. So for me, the delegation itself, it gets very emotional afterwards. I'm going to stop anyway, my time is finished. But for me, the delegation itself in Palestine and coming back here keeps always reminded me of the first time in the United States I came actually in interaction with another activist of color. Many people may not know him, but his name was Reverend Kirkpatrick. And he sang at the first demonstration in 1981 on the occasion of the International Solidarity with the People of Palestine at the United Nations. It was a huge march. I was in Madison, Wisconsin. Everybody went on buses and so on. And he always sang, he will say, we shall overcome, but then he'll say, fight on Palestine, fight on. And we're here to say that we are here. We will stay. We will continue struggling, whether within the College of Ethnic Studies, the San Francisco State University, in terms of liberating Oakland, not occupying Oakland, restoring rights and reparations to indigenous people and people who have suffered from the horrible things that this country has done, as well as around the world, because justice is indivisible. Thank you.
Give a thank you to Dr. Abdulhadi, to all the panelists, and an extra round of applause. So don't go anywhere. We have some extra surprises. We have Ejdur Depka Troop coming up, and we're going to be clearing out the stage just for the dance performance, as well as coming back for the question and answer. We'd also like to invite all of you to join us in the College of Ethnic Studies in room 116 for a reception immediately following the event. Before I continue, I would like to just give an extra round of applause for our organizing committee and all of the individuals and community organizations that made this evening possible. They're all listed in the program booklet, and without them, this evening would not have been possible. As all of you know, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Initiative is still an initiative, and we are working diligently to support it. One of its programs is the Edward Said Distinguished Lecture Series, which 2 years ago brought Dr. Midovat Hatem, who is the president of the Middle East Studies Association nationally at that time. This public program brings distinguished lecturers to come and to give a lecture series to maintain the sense of bridging our community work with academic lectures, engaging our communities inside of the College of Ethnic Studies and inside of AMED. We have some of the young GUPS folks who have baskets. If you would like to make a contribution to the Edward Said Distinguished Lecture Series, we would greatly appreciate it. It would be very, very helpful, especially in difficult economic times in which all university programs are really struggling. Sorry. And I would actually like to introduce to you the El Judur Debke troupe. El Judur, founded in January of 2005, is a dance company whose mission is to present and preserve Palestinian dance, music, and culture, and bring awareness to the Palestinian cause. Members of the group have grown up with Debke as a part of social life and devote time for freestyle improvisational Debke dancing at the end of each of its weekly rehearsals. El Judur is among the few professional Palestinian folkloric dance companies in the United States, and thus is in great demand for performances by the Arab community. To El Judur, Debke is more than just a celebratory event. Its every movement is a political statement and a wake-up call to the world's consciousness. Our preservation of our traditional arts and culture is one form of maintaining existence in which ethnic cleansing is a part of what we're facing as a people. And so Debke has become extraordinarily symbolic of that. And this particular group, El Judur, is also one of the groups, actually is the group that performed at the inauguration of the Edward Said mural inauguration in 2007, and is the main Debke group that performs continuously in the Bay Area. So we're going to finish clearing off the stage and bring them out, and we thank you all for your patience and stay here for a really exciting question and answer. Oh, we also have t-shirts of the mural on sale on your right-hand side, so please don't forget to stop and visit our little table right over here.
فيها حكاية مشوار والطلقة الأولى فيها حكاية مشوار عند الحق نخلي العالي واطيها عند الحق نخلي العالي واطيها وغني عتابة وميجانة وسامر فيها احنا زرعنا البيارات وزيتون وبذار القمح علينا وبيدر ليمون احنا زرعنا البيارات وزيتون وبذار القمح علينا وبيدر ليمون احنا الاشاره يا وطن احنا حنكون احنا الاشاره يا وطن احنا حنكون يوم العرك دروب النصر نضويها يوم العرك دروب النصر نضويها علي الكوفي علي ولونك فيها وغني عتابة وميجانة وسامر فيها
Can we have another round of applause for Gerald? So we're going to just be bringing our table right back out so we can have a little bit of time for question and answer. Unfortunately, we are running late, so it'll have to be cut off quite early because we need to finish by 9:10. Ami and I will be walking around with microphones, so if you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and we will come to you. But also, because we're short on time, we would like to ask people to refrain from making long political speeches. And I know that that's very difficult to do because of all the wonderful things that has been discussed this evening, and I'm sure everyone wants to debate and has comments on it. But if you can refrain from making long political speeches and respectfully give your comment or question, and we should be out of here on time. Also, just want to remind everyone, which I would never have to because we're in a place where we're in joint struggle for justice and liberation, but please be respectful of the speakers and ask your questions or make your comments respectfully. Thank you very much.
Two. No.
Hello? Hi.
Okay.
We have our first question over here.
Okay, Joseph, 1 minute.
First of all, if I may say so, Lenoir Katami's remarks remind me of a Malcolm X quote that said, colonialism is a perpetration that tries to make the wolf look like the lamb and the lamb look like the wolf. My question for you is that I have often been disturbed that the leading white, Jewish, and non-Jewish National Lecture Circuit speakers on the Palestinian issue are often willing to exhaustively note the symptoms of the disease of Zionism, but never the disease of Zionism itself. And so a friend of mine watching from Ann Arbor was really surprised that one speaker even mentioned the Israel lobby, and I was pleasantly surprised that another speaker mentioned the right of the Palestinian people to armed self-defense. So to wrap up my question with brief examples, these so-called left Zionist National Lecture Circuit speakers, to me, seem like people who are willing to criticize long slave hours or slave beatings or sun-up to sundown slave work, but not slavery itself, would be willing to oppose apartheid in the Bantustans of then apartheid South Africa, but not apartheid itself, would be willing to oppose abuse of husband's abuse of women, physical abuse, excuse me, I'm trying to rush, trying to oppose using rods larger than the little finger, but not oppose physical abuse against their wives itself. And so I'm wondering, especially for anyone, but especially for Dr. Lenoir and Dr. Waziyatawin, if they could comment on this particular phenomenon of so-called left Zionists, where they oppose so-called occupation in 10 to 15% of historic Palestine, but not the ideological occupation of all of historic Palestine itself. Thank you.
I just want to say that I think that this is part of the problem about lack of critical thinking among much of the population, and it's the double standards that we see employed all the time. I hear, well, in fact, one of my colleagues in my department, Jeff Corntassel, uses the the language of the Free Tibet Syndrome to talk about Americans and Canadians who get involved in issues in other parts of the world, but not the issues that are going on in their own backyard. So people might be committed to freeing Tibet, but they aren't committed to freeing Dakota homeland or Salish homeland or something like that. I think that it's our obligation to continue to point out those double standards when they exist.
Yes, I think in any struggle you will find that you have people who conciliate the struggle and who as you described, are limit their criticisms to what was in the South African context called petty apartheid. And in that context, we had people who called for affirmative action in South Africa. Both whites and blacks inside South Africa and whites and blacks in the United States were calling for affirmative action, quote unquote, and so in the context of what I would call soft-core Zionism, you do have both Israelis in Israel and Jewish people in the United States that are willing to criticize Israel, but don't take it the next step in terms of looking at the liberation of Palestinians. And so whenever we see that, we have to lift it up and analyze it and expose it. And hopefully we're building a movement that can do that. And even within Jewish communities in the United States, there are young Jewish activists who are beginning to do that, who are beginning to take it to that next level and challenge within their own communities these soft-core Zionists that are willing to only look at the harshest parts of the occupation and condemn those without condemning the whole system of colonialism.
Thank you for your speech tonight, if you will, or your presentation. I guess my question for you, I know many of you were involved in the civil rights movement here in the States. For many Palestinians, of which I'm one of, our frustration is with the lack of progress on the ground, and you've been there and you've seen it for yourself. Many of us within the community have grown, not to get into a whole political spiel, but my question, I guess, just to get to the point is, where do you see us going from here? If we fight, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. I'm sorry not to butcher your name, but I do highly respect what you said. We do want to fight and resist as much as possible. What do we do? What's your take on our situation, seeing it for yourself? And we've tried peace, and obviously we've gotten nothing. So what do you recommend that we do differently, if you will?
Good.
Are you going to answer the question?
I'll let him answer.
You guys?
Okay, I think that the Palestinians right now, for me, have been a tremendous source of inspiration. I think that the Palestinian struggle is a testament to success in many ways, because Israel is constantly pushed to greater and greater measures, which reveal the brutality of occupation. And so I think that, you know, this is going to be a long haul. As an Indigenous woman in the United States, knowing that the United States government supports the State of Israel, and that we have to be vigilant about attacking empire, about attacking imperialism. My struggle right now, or one of the efforts that I'm involved with or committed to, is to the dismantling of industrial civilization. And I think that if we attack empire here, it will affect empire everywhere. It'll affect empire in Israel. And that's what I think we need to do.
Somebody else?
Well, I was just going to say that